There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains discussions of pedophilia and child abuse. Listener discretion is advised.
In 1983, in Manhattan Beach, California, one woman named Judy Johnson put forward an allegation. Her 2.5-year-old son was, at the time, attending McMartin preschool. Johnson claimed that her son had been sexually abused by a teacher at the school named Ray Buckley. Her claims were unlike anything police had ever heard before. Although there was no evidence of abuse taking place, police decided to send a form letter to about 200 parents of students at the preschool. It asked them to speak to their children and listed off possible abuse they might have experienced. Over the next 7 years, 7 teachers, 6 of them women, were charged with more than 200 counts of child abuse, involving more than 40 children. There were accusations of satanic rituals, animal sacrifices, administering of drugs, the creation of child exploitation material, and flying children to faraway places where they were molested. The accusations became increasingly bizarre. By the late 1980s, McMartin had become a household word. The trial is among the longest and costliest criminal proceedings in the history of the United States. What emerged, however, was that none of these events had ever taken place. Today, the children who spoke to authorities say they knew at the time their allegations were false. So what was behind this hysteria? And what was behind the Satanic Panic that followed? I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Melbourne author Ruth McIver about the period of moral panic in the US that became known as the Satanic Panic. It was sparked by a fear that satanic rituals and occult practices were being forced upon children. I wanted to start with the McMartin preschool case, which took place in LA, I believe. What happened?
From what I understand, basically parents of children who attended the school began to make complaints that their children were being ritually abused. Some of these stories were incredibly fantastical and really graphic, horrific kind of details. In the Kern County case, for example, I mean, it really kind of beggars belief, but children were given toys by educators at the preschool, which would allow them to summon the devil. So one in particular was a drum kit that apparently if the child would beat on it, it would summon Satan. Another instance was a parent saying that her child's nebulizer, the child was asthmatic, was filled with some kind of like animal fertilizer. So they were given things that they were ingesting that were poisonous. They were forced to witness the murder of doves, which is obviously like a Christian kind of symbol. In one case, they were even said to be buried alive and then dug up because Satan saved them. So the thing that sort of seems to be consistent in both cases is that there were these fantastical stories of child abuse and children giving testimony in courtrooms about this kind of child abuse that were just so detailed and bizarre, frankly, and horrific. And the adults who were involved, who were the educators, were convicted of these crimes. In one case, I was just reading an article recently about the Kern County case, and they spent 21 years in prison. They're now entitled to a massive settlement. It looks to be something like $32 million US, but obviously losing 21 years of your life and, the mental torture and the anguish that these people went through. But yeah, obviously this doesn't happen just as the result of an accusation. There has to be a climate that fosters and supports claims of this nature. So you have police, you have the judiciary system, and then you have the media that's supporting these kind of just wild things that are happening, which seems so bizarre and fantastical now that they're almost funny, I think, to a contemporary reader if there wasn't so much pain involved for the children, especially who went through these kind of trials, but also the people who were accused.
So they were accused and went to trial. I would assume that they required some evidence in order to be convicted. Was it that there was so much panic that innocent until proven guilty wasn't something that they practiced?
From what I understand with these kind of cases, it seems to be the notion of the expert witnesses. So this seems to be kind of a common theme and a common problem with these cases, where you get corroborations from, say, law enforcement who put out videos about these kind of satanic cabals and things to watch out for. And then you have psychologists and psychiatrists. I'm not 100% sure in terms of the evidence on the bodies of children, but one would imagine if you were prompting a child and feeding a child stories like that, it's not a suspension of disbelief to say that perhaps, something was done to the children. But, you can also explain away lack of physical evidence too when you have these expert witnesses and these stories that, frankly, people want to hear and they want to believe.
We know that statistically, if a child comes forward or, a woman or a man comes forward with allegations of sexual abuse, that statistically it's very likely that they're telling the truth. So this is statistically unlikely that you have a case of students coming forward who were not actually abused. Where did the idea of this actually start and how did it become so contagious?
One of the primary underlying things, as far as I can see, is that it actually came out of this really twisted desire to protect children. So it's got to do a lot with, and this is what a lot of theorists sort of speculate, that there was a Child Protection Act that was passed in 1974 that actually sort of formally acknowledged that children were being abused in their homes. And so this was kind of just like a recently discussed thing. And so people were starting to talk about child abuse. They were starting to become aware. And then there was the whole stranger danger of the 80s and this sense of someone is going to harm your children. And somehow I think the convergence of, say, really high religious atmosphere, cultural conservatism, evangelical Christianity, and then somehow these discourses kind of combined to create this climate where it was ripe for allegations. What I find really interesting is that I think in the 80s, it was a case of somehow adults rewriting their own traumas of the past. Perhaps they'd been abused as children. Perhaps these were their sort of anxieties and fears, and they somehow projected them onto their own children or the nation's children. So it was sort of like this mass projection, which obviously we've seen before historically happen, namely in the Salem witch trials. But, it's basically came out of this really misguided place of saying, children are at risk. How do we protect them? And then they ended up damaging these children in this horrific way.
How would you describe Satanism? Like, for people who aren't particularly well versed in themes around Christianity, when people had this sort of satanic panic, like, what were they so afraid of?
I don't think it's necessarily Satanism itself or even necessarily the occult, although I do believe that from the 60s to 70s onwards, there was a fear of occultism and sort of counterculture and different beliefs. And I think that had a lot to do with, say, the 60s and 70s. And so then you get reactionary kind of things like Charles Manson. We have the Zodiac Killer. We have all of these kind of violent crimes. They have occult flavors, but really very little true links with Satanism. Satanism is a religion like any other. There's been a great documentary about it recently called Hail Satan. And Satanists don't necessarily even worship Satan. This is my understanding of it anyway. It is a religion. And, Anton LaVey's book, The Satanic Verses, was a really key kind of book. I think it was probably something that people use as kind of a bit of a fashion accessory. It was a way of being subversive. And I think Satanism is interested with inversions. So it's sort of like doing the opposite of Christianity. So I think in a sense that all of this stuff, these rituals and the things that are being described in these trials and cases, they don't really resemble anything like what a Satanist would practice. They seem to just be these kind of bizarre interpretations of what people think satanic practices are.
On the sort of other side of the country, and I think this was in the 1980s, there was a man named Ricky Casso. How did he get wrapped up into the narrative about the Satanic Panic?
Well, I think this will also just like a little nod to the way that heavy metal music also got drawn into this whole perfect storm of the Satanic Panic. Ricky Casso was, a metal-loving teenager, like many. I believe, from what I understand, and I think that there is a documentary coming out this year that will maybe explore less sensationally his life and what led to these crimes, because everything that I've read is highly sensational and it's really difficult to actually glean what the truth is. But he seemed to be a pretty normal kid. He seemed to be a very normal suburban kid who really liked football and had a nice family, and then started getting pretty involved into drugs and, obviously identified with the heavy metal kind of music scene and, loved wearing these clothing that would signify that. But more troubling than that, he started displaying antisocial behaviours. And what it seemed to be was that he almost became completely out of control. He was a teenager that was not even really living at home. He was living in the woods part of the time or in people's garages, abusing drugs, and I mean up to 40 tabs of acid a day, which led him to call himself the Acid King. At one point, he was committed, and then he was being investigated by police for digging up a Native American skeleton in a cemetery. Apparently, he was walking around town saying things like, "Hail Satan," carrying satanic verses, and really interested in the occult. I don't think anyone really took a lot of that seriously because he was wacky and a druggie. So basically, he's still a really young, troubled kid, and he got involved with other young, troubled kids. And basically, according to them, they were part of this group. They called themselves a cult. This is a self-proclaimed cult, of course, but they were on so many hallucinogens, it's really hard to glean fact from fiction. When you read the articles from the time, like say from the 80s, like the Rolling Stone did a big article interviewing friends and stuff, it's really what you would imagine teen speak to be. There's so much rumor and innuendo, like he sacrificed animals. That's not really true. Or he said that he was fully into Satanism, but really he was just kind of like messed up. So it's really hard to know whether or not he was this really hardcore occultist. But there was no organization to this cult. It was just basically a bunch of kids, and he had a lot of drugs. He was selling them, but mostly using them. And he ended up enticing a teenager that he knew who, again, isn't very clearly fleshed out in these kind of narratives as a sacrifice to Satan. But again, it seems to be a petty drug debt that led Ricky Casso to want to murder him. Two of his friends, one of them who was apparently charged with holding Gary Lauers down, who was the teen who stole the drugs, was basically kind of his sidekick. Apparently he was called Dracula because he had funny looking teeth. Also a very normal kid, but also troubled. They all seem to fit this pattern. They're very affluent. They just seem to be, since junior high school, getting in trouble. And then it led to this situation this night in the woods where they were taking PCP and mescaline, but it actually turned out to be microdots of LSD. So it seems like they took maybe 10 hits of that. I'm not sure, plus PCP. So very hard to know. And they murdered him. Ricky Casso was the instigator and the ringleader. But the worst part about it was obviously there were satanic elements to the crime or ritualistic elements to the crime. But it was the callousness of the crime. It was the way that Casso boasted about the crime afterwards. And he allegedly took teens to the woods and said, you know, this is what we've done. They were showing the body to other teenagers, and eventually someone called the cops, and then there was an arrest. And Casso actually killed himself in prison. He hung himself. But there's pictures of him being arrested, and he's got his AC/DC T-shirt on, and he's got a picture of Satan on it, and his eyes are just bugging out of his head. And his arrest picture looks so much like kind of a hybrid between Charles Manson and Richard Ramirez. It's such a compelling and striking and terrifying image. And I was really surprised when I encountered the image because I was like, I've never seen this before. And it's on skateboard decks. All these people sort of like hijacked the image of Ricky Casso. And when you look at the list of movies and books and bands that have tributed Ricky Casso or referenced the Acid King case, it's phenomenal. It's like he had this massive influence on pop culture, yet I'd never even heard of the case. You know, even the band Weezer, that song Teenage Dirtbag, which is actually a really innocent song, that was inspired by the Ricky Casso case.
That's incredible. I had no idea either, and I hadn't heard his name before that context.
No, and I mean, you would imagine metal bands and things like that would kind of take on that trope, but it seemed like youth counterculture embraced him as like an anti-hero, which is really interesting given how unrepentant and frankly dangerous he was.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Melbourne author Ruth McIver about the Satanic Panic, a period of moral panic consisting of over 12,000 unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse, starting in the United States in the 1980s. A decade later, the Satanic Panic came up again in reference to a crime that took place in Arkansas. Who were the Memphis Three?
Well, obviously in the case of Ricky Casso and Jimmy Troiano, who was actually acquitted, these young men who were accused were wrongfully accused. So this, you know, is a really tragic case, and it's something that really impacted me and stuck with me. And I think, and it obviously did for a lot of people. And as a result, also, it's a much more well-known case. And what happened there was really tragic. And I think it's really important to also not forget the victims in that case, because there were 3 little boys who were murdered. And they were found in a wooded area, and they were naked, they were hogtied, and there was some mutilation of one of the children. They were only 8-year-old boys, really, really sad, out riding their bikes. And so Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly, these 3 teenagers who were, again, really similar in the sense that they were probably using drugs, into heavy metal music, looked real different, and were kind of potentially outcasts in their society, especially somewhere like West Memphis, where they're from, you know, where it's highly Christian. They were seen already to be troublemakers. They'd had some brushes with the law in the same way the other teens had. So Damien Eccles, and if you ever hear him speak, you'll see how articulate he is and how sensitive he is. He was really interested in magic and religion, and actually a practicing Wiccan, which is very different than a Satanist. But already when these boys' bodies were found, and this was, you know, the difference in this case also obviously is that this was in the 90s and that was in the 80s, they had already been pretty much charged in the minds of the police. They believed that these boys were guilty. And so they basically got Jesse Miskelly to make a false confession. Jesse Miskelly had an IQ of 72. He believed he would get a reward of $35,000 so that he could buy his dad a truck. So it was his false confession, which again involved something bizarre like a Sabbath in the woods, and then, you know, really horrible kind of murder of the boys, which involved a sexual act and mutilation. And this resulted in their trial, and then they had some crazy expert witnesses, which again we've seen before in these other cases, where he described the dates and the ages of the boys, making kind of like lining up in an occult fashion that the murders occurred around Beltane, which is a pagan holiday. So there you go. And that was believed by the judge. The judge actually, and this guy had a PhD in the Mail. So it wasn't like he was a really reputable expert. There was also an unreliable testimony from somebody who wanted to be a novice detective, and she got her own 8-year-old son involved in this too. She later recanted her statement, but it was too late. They were in prison and Damien Eccles was actually sentenced to death, and they served an enormous amount of time for a crime that they didn't commit. And the only way that they got out was making this really unusual plea deal, which didn't really get them the exoneration that they deserved. And not only that, it stopped them from being able to sue the state effectively. And I've just read recently that the DNA evidence now, it's so dated and it's either been basically eroded and some of it has been lost. So now the chance for them to actually really properly exonerate themselves is now most likely lost.
So did they ever find out who actually committed that crime, or were there other suspects, or was it just this was the kind of narrow focus?
I mean, when you consider a child murder, and obviously this is unusual because this was 3 friends and it wasn't just one child or even siblings, the police could have gone down a particular path. So they could have said, look, it's likely a relative or it's likely a local pedophile. But the third option was it's an occult activity and it's likely the work of a cult. And because, like I was sort of saying, there was a whole kind of procedure and a textbook about satanic crimes, so it seemed that they just seized the third option. There were lots of tips and angles, and in the documentary you see that there was a knife belonging to the stepfather that wasn't properly seized. There was another man who was a clear suspect and he was ruled out. And this happens a lot in crimes where the police zero in, they have a suspect in mind. And these 3 were really easy targets. I think this is a really clear case also of social inequality. When you read Damien Eccles' book, his first book, he's written several, he was so poor. He was saying like dirt poor is actually literal in his case. They just had a dirt floor. He lived in a trailer. None of them had any money. 2 of them were intelligent and articulate. That doesn't matter. When you're a misfit and you don't have any representation, you don't have the means to a good lawyer. And also, people will point out Damien Eccles, being the age that he was, really bright, probably a little bit arrogant, didn't do himself any favours in the courtroom. He came across as seeming a little bit superior, and he kind of thought they were all a bit dumb and that it was ridiculous because he was so confident in the fact that he didn't do it. So all these factors sort of unfortunately implicated them. And if it wasn't for these documentaries, I really believe they would still be behind bars.
Looking at all of these crimes together, is there anything in terms of ritual or what was done to the victims that was particularly satanic or did look as though there was a pattern? Or is it just almost a way to explain evil?
I think it's the latter, because when I was reading about the actual crime scenes, and obviously, one is only privy to certain details, it does seem that the victims were bound in a particular way and there was a mutilation of one of the boys. However, in one of the documentaries, I recall the police saying that it was possible that that was due to animal activity. So you can make evidence point to occultism. From what I can understand, I don't think there was even any DNA evidence or any physical evidence of a sexual assault. I mean, obviously the way that they were positioned, the fact that they didn't have their clothes on, and the fact that they were murdered in itself suggests a sexual motive. But then obviously if you want to take a leap and say that's a sexual part of the sacrifice or that's a part of a satanic ritual, it seems to be that they wanted the story of Satanism or an occult murder to fit the murder of these little boys. And I think the greatest injustice there, besides from obviously the imprisonment of these young men, is these little boys never getting the justice that they deserved.
Why do you think that police and prosecutors and the media were so intent on tying this to the occult or to satanic practices? Like, why has it been so persistent, especially in the US context, for decades?
That's an interesting question, because I think obviously there is an agenda there. I think it's a combination of law enforcement having this belief that there were these satanic and occult groups practicing, but that youth were sort of out of control, that drugs and heavy metal music were leading them down this path. And they evidenced this. And then you get that supported by the media, which then cements and solidifies this idea that this is a reality and that this is something to be feared. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with, say, in the 80s with Reaganism, with, this cultural conservatism, with this belief in wanting to reinforce Christianity and family values, to wanting to punish miscreants or people who weren't doing that. So I think that supported that. But then, obviously you've got the court system and the judiciary and everything that sort of somehow seem to sort of corroborate that. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's just something that was an unfortunate belief that was somehow widely held and then reinforced by cases that made a precedent.
Do you see it as treading into conspiracy theory territory? Like, is that what this is?
Totally. But then obviously when you look at stuff like QAnon, that's the wildest thing that I'd ever read about. And I've got to confess, like, I know just a little bit about QAnon. And I think also as an Australian who's not on 4chan, I probably wouldn't know that much about it, but it bears a striking resemblance. And there are a lot of well-educated and, seemingly normal people that actually really believe the beliefs of QAnon. And in fact, it's one of those things that's broken down families and alienated people in the States, from what I understand. And I think it's come over to Australia too because of the internet and, with this digital age. Personally speaking, growing up in the 80s in Perth, I felt the impacts of the Satanic Panic, and I felt that it was reinforced a lot by my education system. And I remember media coverage. It felt very real to me. And that's why, I've obviously really resonated with it. But, I think it's unusual because, in Australia, we were so far away from the States. We were getting Americanized, but we still were kind of a little bit more distant because of the lack of ease of travel, ability to travel, and obviously the internet. But it definitely was something felt.
In what way did you feel it? Because I'm thinking back to sort of the 90s and, it's adjacent a little bit, but Blair Witch Project and certain cultural references that came out, that it did feel real and like something that existed as an underbelly, that there were people who sort of did do these specific practices and that it was really dangerous. What did you see in your cultural context that was reminiscent of a satanic panic?
Well, I think with Perth, for example, being an incredibly isolated, highly Christian city in the 80s, and I felt that was kind of the norm. And I hope that people from Perth forgive me for this. I found Perth very culty also. And I think there's a couple of factors, but one of them is definitely geographical. And it was a very conservative kind of time and place. I remember this being also because I went to a very kind of Christian school. And my brother and I were both into heavy metal. We were into AC/DC. My brother was into Iron Maiden. And when he wore one of those T-shirts, I remember family friends or parents' friends would be like, you have to put that shirt on inside out. There was also the story circulating at the time that Cabbage Patch Dolls were possessed, which really kind of resonates back to that McMartin preschool case where basically, they were an instrument of the devil. And I remember that really clearly. And I also know friends who were older that grew up, so say they were born in like the early 70s, and they were really into KISS, Kids of Satan Service, and they were actually forced to burn their KISS records. So there was this sense of, a prevailing sense of Christianity, a prevailing sense of if you're different or you look different, you're a danger, you're a potential corrupter, or that you could have been corrupted. And in my primary school, I was taken into a room. My brother had drawn a picture of the priest doing the Eucharist, you know, when they hold the body of Christ in both hands, but he drew it in the style of an Iron Maiden drawing. So it was like, you know, burning skull. Just that kind of full metal illustration, so creative. But we were taken into a little room and I was asked what time I went to bed, what kind of movies I watched, what kind of music we listened to, real cultural and lifestyle policing. Were our parents married? They were divorced. Like, so interrogated, you know, and I remember being 8 and thinking, this isn't right. Like, you shouldn't be asking me this. And also, like, I'm kind of scared. And like, what if I answer the wrong way, you know? And I'm being sent into forced counselling because of it. And then what you do, I think, as a child, you rebel and react to that. So, yeah, you're going to call me a little devil child. Well, I'm going to act like one, you know, and I'm going to wear my AC/DC T-shirt. So there has always been this sense of a moral panic to begin with, but also youth panic, a fear of children and youths being out of control.
The last thing I wanted to ask was whether you think that elements of the Satanic Panic still exist.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. There was a story a couple of years back and it sort of just dissolved, but it was a story of a family in the Blue Mountains that ran a circus school. There were these accusations and I remember reading them and thinking, geez, this is really reminiscent of, you know, the 80s. Children having needles put in their eyes, being picked up by their penises, like just like these disgusting, abhorrent, but also just bizarre and, you know, forced to eat and drink feces. There seems to be a really common theme around these just, frankly, the most disgusting things that you can imagine. And it turned out to be, you know, fundamentally false. But this was not long ago. This was 2016. And I believe that there was an actual current affair episode talking to the family that were involved. So it seems to just keep going. And then obviously, like I said, with QAnon, I think that's the closest thing that we're seeing as a widespread phenomenon. But I think there are these isolated cases still. And it is about adults putting words and fantasies into the minds and mouths of children and, you know, in this perverse desire to protect them, but in the most damaging and harmful way to the children and to the accused.
Ruth McIver is a Melbourne-based crime writer with a PhD in true crime-inspired fiction from Curtin University. Her first novel, Nothing Gold, was runner-up for the inaugural Banjo Prize and was one of 7 novels selected to be pitched at the Bloody Scotland Crime Writing Festival in 2014. Her latest novel, I Shot the Devil, earned her the Ritchell Prize for Emerging Writers and is billed to be the crime thriller of 2021. You can find a link to it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, let us know. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or share the episodes with friends so more people can hear our stories. And if you want to hear more from me, you can find me on Mamma Mia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as our new podcast, Cancelled, about who's in, who's out, and who cares in the world of celebrities.